particular stuff. I've been teaching intro psychology, and this just doesn't fit in because there's just too much. So it was fun to get back into it, and I hope I'm not too rusty talking about some of this stuff about sexual development. And chances are I'm going to slip into professor mode here, so please, if you would like to ask questions, I would love for this to turn into more of a conversation at some point. But I was asked to just kind of go through some of the basic development, some of which you may have learned back in school, some of which you probably did not learn in school, and a refresher is always a good thing. So this is biological sex development from conception. We're going to talk first about the typical process that happens to being identified as either male or female at birth, and we'll talk about some of the variations that can occur as well. So first off, I've got, I have a lot of words on these slides, mostly to keep me on track. I don't expect you to be able to read them all. Some of the prenatal conception that you may remember from way back when you were in school is that we inherit from our mother and father a bunch of chromosomes, and the last two are labeled as the sex chromosomes, which is either the X chromosome that we get from our mothers or the Y chromosome for males if they get that from their father. So female humans have two X chromosomes. During the meiosis process, those divide, and offspring get one of those two from their mother. And the male has an X and a Y. Those two divide, and the offspring will get either the X or the Y. So the Y makes them biologically male. The X would make them biologically female. So the father determines the sex of the child, the biological sex. So what we don't always go into detail with kids in school is that the process of physical development starts from kind of a undifferentiated point. So an embryo, once they inherit the genes and they begin to develop prenatally, they develop two sets of ductwork systems. All offspring, all embryos have the same. There's one that's the Mullerian system, which is eventually develops into the default kind of female internal systems. And one is the Wolffian system. So both are present. The gonads are undifferentiated at this point, and the external genitalia, as it starts to develop in an embryo, is undifferentiated as well. So all of the tissue is present for every male and female. It's something that happens during prenatal development that determines whether it starts becoming more biologically male or female. So you might not be able to see these diagrams really well, but I found a quick one with, and you might be able to see the colors. So the Mullerian system, they've got in pink, and the Wolffian system in blue. It's all present. So what happens about 6 weeks into development, if the embryo has inherited the XY chromosome pattern from its parents, it starts to develop differently. And so at about 6 weeks, the embryo starts to release some androgens, and that's testosterone is a type of androgen we're most familiar with. And we have only recently, fairly recently in the 90s, discovered a sex-determining region of the Y chromosome that kind of sparks all of this. So it's a gene that begins all of this sex differentiation for a genetic male. So that signals the release of antigens, of hormones, and the differentiation process begins for the biology. At this point also there's an anti-Mullerian enzyme that's released, so the Mullerian ductwork that was there before starts to decay, and the Wolffian ductwork begins to develop into the internal genitalia for a male. So that whole process starts really early in pregnancy, during this 6th week, and then continues on through, of course, the rest of the pregnancy. So that undifferentiated genitalia that was there before starts to grow and develop into the external genitalia of a male, so a penis and a scrotum. The gonads are internal at this point, and they start to develop into testes, which will produce sperm as the child reaches puberty. And the Wolffian duct system becomes these internal structures like the vas deferens and the epididymis, which is one of my favorite words to say. It's just kind of a fun word to say, epididymis. But the testes are still internal. Those do not descend into the scrotum and leave the body until the 9th month, into right before the baby is born. And so a baby that has inherited this XY chromosome pattern has gone through all of these changes due to the hormones and enzymes and everything that happens, will most likely be identified by the doctor or the midwife at birth as male and assigned to be male. So that's the kind of a typical process for that. Now you'll notice that even if you can't read all of my words, and I'd be happy to share these slides with you later if you'd like them, that there's fewer words for an embryo that has inherited the XX chromosome pattern and is a genetically female embryo. And that's because we've typically thought about the female as being more of the default process. So there's nothing that has to happen at the 6th week for a genetically female embryo to start developing the external and internal systems of a female. It just sort of happens. So if the other doesn't, there's no need for an anti-Wolffian enzyme or anything to get rid of that. It just kind of disappears. The Mullerian system comes into play, develops into the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the upper part of the vagina, if you want to really get specific. The ducts that were the Wolffian ones close spontaneously a little bit later, and then those same tissues that became the external genitalia in a genetic male become the clitoris and the labia for the genetic female. The gonads then develop into ovaries instead of testes. They stay within the body, and these babies are typically assigned female at birth. Okay, so that's the process. I'll give you a test later that you can remember.
Can we say epididymis too?
Yes. Also epididymis, yes, spell epididymis. So the process is the one that we like to think just happens all the time, and that it's the biological process that occurs for all embryos that you inherit just one of two genetic patterns of either XX or XY, that all of this stuff happens just as by default, as it should, and we all live happily ever after. But we know that things are always more complicated. Humans are more complicated. And the more we learn about biology, what they don't tell you oftentimes during the normal course of 5th grade sex education or 10th grade biology, when you get a little more detail, is that all of this stuff has always been more complicated than we like to think it is. So just briefly, for sex assignment, This is something that has, up until very recently, and well, still for the most part, is something that is just a visual inspection. So a midwife, a doctor says, if you watch Call the Midwife, which I have watched obsessively, the first thing they announce is it's a boy or a girl, and that's done just by a visual inspection. So that's assuming that all of the process has gone fine and that the external genitalia are very identifiable as either male or female. Nowadays, many more people are getting, they're identifying the sex of the baby before birth. For the longest time, that was done during ultrasound, so it had to wait until this 6th week until you could visually identify what might be a penis. Could be a finger, could be just something on the ultrasound. But now we've got much better ultrasound. We've got 3D ultrasounds that people are getting, and they do blood tests and they look at the genetics as well. So people are learning the sex of the baby very early on. In fact, I just met a young woman yesterday who was happy to announce she was 12 weeks pregnant, and it was a girl. So she knew already, she'd done the tests, and she was certain that she was having a girl. But mostly, for the most part, we do this during, at birth with a visual inspection and a sign one way or the other. So the complicating factors are often called intersex. More recently, we're starting to use the terminology of differences in sex development, which you might hear as DSD. And we always need more acronyms. So it depends on who you're talking to. Some people don't like the term intersex. Some people haven't gotten used to the term differences in sex development. There is an intersex society of North America that has a lot of information if you're interested in these sorts of things. They are a group of active people who claim the term intersect, although it's still kind of a loosey-goosey term. So their estimates, everybody wants to know the estimates, about 1 in 5,000 births have ambiguous genitalia. So it's not necessarily quite clear whether the child should be assigned as male or female at the time that they're born. And that can result from a lot of different factors. I'm going to give you a few so you can see some of the variety. There's more than, of course, what I can tell you. But the identification process can be a little bit more challenging for these births that fall somewhere in the middle, and so we talk about them as intersexed. So the Intersex Society of North America defines intersex as a socially constructed category that captures the many variations in physical anatomy and so on and so forth. So socially constructed, if you're not familiar with these kind of academic terms, means that we have decided that this is a category, not that it's a true and objective kind of category. And as you start thinking about this, I want you to start thinking about where do we draw the lines then between male and intersex and female. What visual inspection needs to happen, what sizes need to be documented in order for someone to fall into the right category. So some examples, let's start with some prenatal hormone factors. So I mentioned that at this 6th week, the genetically male embryo starts releasing hormones and other sorts of chemicals that start triggering this process. Well, what happens when something changes during that prenatal development? So one example is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So the adrenal gland sits on the kidney, and this is a genetic mutation that causes several different hormonal imbalances. One with cortisol that you think about as a stress hormone and causes some physical issues for people that have this disorder as they grow. But more important for our conversation today, it can cause an excess of androgens to be released prenatally. And if those androgens are released, it can, and the embryo is genetically female, so an XX chromosome pattern instead of an XY chromosome pattern, their external genitalia may develop to look more like male external genitalia. So it leads to an enlarged clitoris that is somewhere visually maybe too large to be a clitoris, too small to be a penis, somewhere in between. And the labia might close, which happens when the scrotum develops, that tissue develops, either the scrotum or the external labia. The labia might become fused, like part of that process started, and so the external genitalia might lead to these ambiguous genitalia, which makes it a little harder to assign sex at birth. If the embryo is genetically male, has an XY chromosome pattern, then that can result in there's this excess of androgens floating around. They might have a very early puberty. So we think of puberty as happening right as you're turning into the teens. They might go very much earlier and start to develop as males do much earlier on. So I've got some incidences here. So the classic form where it's very severe, that leads to the more the genitalia being very ambiguous, if not being classified male at birth, about 1 in 15,000, so really rare. There's milder forms of this where it doesn't cause as much of an extreme, and that would be like 1 in 1,000 births. So still rare, but much more common for it not to be quite so severe. So stop me if I'm confusing you or just babbling on too much. All right, another example that's happens with hormones prenatally and beyond is androgen insensitivity syndrome. So with a genetically male embryo with an XY chromosome pattern, it's the androgens that cause the development of the biological sex characteristics. Some genetically male embryos are born with this androgen insensitivity, which means the androgens are all there, but their bodies don't respond to them. So even though everything's happening as it should, externally they're being bathed in the testosterone they need to develop their biological characteristics, since their bodies are insensitive to that, they don't. And so the default of developing more female external characteristics happens. And so these babies can be born looking externally as female, easily identified as female because there hasn't been any changes that result from the androgens. So their external genitalia looks female. They may have, they call a blind vagina, so it doesn't connect to anything. They don't develop the internal uterus and that sort of thing. Their testes don't descend, so there's nothing there as well. But they're maybe producing testosterone. So a lot of folks with this condition, they can grow, and it's not until puberty that anybody realizes that something's different. They grow up as girls, they do all the girl stuff, and it's that they never start menstruating at puberty. They go to doctors, and then the doctor figures out what's happening at that point. But otherwise, their development seems to be quite normal from external standards. So this again can also be complete, like no sensitivity to androgens whatsoever. So they don't develop the facial hair or anything that you would expect a male to develop at puberty. And then there's some partial androgen insensitivity, but we don't know the incidence of that because it's just may never be diagnosed. So they may develop as male, but they might not develop a whole lot of external masculine characteristics as a result. Yet more examples, just to confuse you more. And one more example of this, of prenatal hormones that might be different from what we think of as typical. This 5-alpha reductase deficiency syndrome, that's a mouthful for you as well, is when an XY embryo, so genetically male, lacks the enzyme necessary for normal sexual development. So they may develop ambiguous genitalia, and so at birth they may not be easily identified as fitting into a male or female category. Oftentimes they're assigned to be female at birth, and in the past, and I'm not sure they do it quite so much, they probably did some sex assignment surgery in infancy to make things all match. And then at puberty, their testosterone levels go up as genetic males do, and that can lead to the development of these more masculine secondary sex characteristics. So hair growth, pubic hair, their penis and scrotum may start to grow, and voice changes. So in severe cases, there's some cases of this in the Dominican Republic, that a child that's raised female and everybody assumed it was female suddenly becomes male at puberty. Everything just changes. And so that, excuse me, it's about 1 in 4,500 births. Especially the severe forms of that. Yes?
The ratios seem to be kind of rare, but when you think of how many hundreds of thousands or millions of births there are per year, all of a sudden there are more people than we would realize with these kind of challenges or characteristics, right?
Absolutely.
They would number in the thousands rather than 10.
Absolutely, and since we don't, these are things that are often hidden. We consider them to be private. We don't know who or really the extent of it, because some may just go undiagnosed for their entire lives. I think I saw just recently, as I was preparing for this, that there was a 70-year-old man who had fathered children, like 4 children, had gone in for a hernia surgery, and they found out the hernia was a uterus and fallopian tubes. So it could be that we just never know, and for ourselves we may never know unless something leads us for an investigation. So absolutely, and then I would add on to that even just the regular physical variation that we all have, it's just hard to determine, where one category ends and one starts. So let me also give you a few examples of some chromosomal factors that throw even more monkeys into the wrenches here. So there's a fairly common, rare by genetic standards, but we call it Turner syndrome, where a genetic female inherits, instead of getting 2 X's, inherits one that functions and either not one at all, so they only have 1 X chromosome altogether. They might inherit 2, but the other one doesn't function. So it's the chromosomal pattern XO because there's something missing there. So these babies are identified as female at birth. Things tend to progress fairly well. There's some physical characteristics that are somewhat common with Turner syndrome girls. They have a broad chest. They might have some webbing on their necks. There's some other things, but that varies quite a bit. You might not be able to identify it right away. And everything seems to happen just fine. At puberty, they don't develop secondary sex characteristics, when some are diagnosed, it's not until puberty as a result. So they can get hormone replacement and develop. They're infertile for the most part, so they can't have their own children. children, but they can, adopt and do sorts of things. And then a couple genetic variations that happen with Y chromosomes. So the Klinefelter syndrome is a disorder or condition, I should say, where an embryo inherits a second X. So instead of having just XY, they have an XXY. Things just didn't divide as they should have. So these babies and people tend to have kind of typical biological characteristics. They produce less testosterone. They have an extra Y or extra X there to boost that. And this one is the most common of the ones we've looked at, about 1 in 500 births. Oftentimes may not even be diagnosed unless you're doing genetic tests to see what somebody's chromosomes are. And then it can also be possible to inherit a second Y. And so the double Y, XYY, is an embryo that gets that additional Y chromosome. They have few physical differences. They tend to be a little taller than average. For a while, they talked about this as super Y syndrome, and they thought that there was some aggressive tendencies, but the research there really isn't good, a little biased, so there really doesn't tend to be much of a difference with these folks either. So that's kind of an overview then of these biological things. And so you can start to feel that what we like to think of as a binary, we talk about sex as a binary, those words come out a lot these days, where it's either male or female, that there's a lot of variations that put us more on a continuum or a spectrum, or however you want to define it, maybe from male to female, but there's a lot of people that are more in the middle than we might expect. And then we have to add into all of this our brains. And for a long time we've tried to pinpoint whether brains are male or female, and that explains a lot of things. But the reality is that our brains are both male and female. And we're learning more that brains are very plastic, about brain plasticity quite a bit these days. So we used to think you were born, you had your brain, you grew up, and then it was set in stone, and then your brain was set. But now we know that even through adulthood, it's constantly changing based on experience and things that we're exposed to. And so even brains that we might think of as being male or female at some point may still change due to our experiences and things that we're exposed to in our environments. So I'd like to hopefully leave you to have some conversation about this rather than me talking at you. And so I started thinking about how what happens is that we assign people to be either male or female at birth, and then once we have assigned them, we have a lot of expectations about what they will like, what colors they will prefer, what toys they want to play with, what careers they want to pursue. And so there's a lot of assumptions that the gender will match the biology of a person. So again, in academia we talk all the time about the difference between sex and gender, but I'm not sure that everybody understands that. And we talk about sex as being these biological things, and gender as being the stuff that we as a society associate with those biological things. So a female child might be expected to have a feminine gender, as those things match. And these days we talk about people being cisgender, meaning that they identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So I wanted to open it up to some questions for you. So we make a lot of these assumptions about what boys and girls are like and what they will do. So how do you see, in this day and age, boys and girls being treated differently from each other, just based on these assumptions of their biology?
Well, I think sports has been in the headlines a lot.
Yeah.
You know.
So can you tell me more about which is of sports and boys and girls? Is it that girls don't play sports, or are there different sports that boys and girls play?
It's the expectation of competition.
Okay.
Okay, is where I'm thinking, and there's been a lot in the news about the transgender people swimming on the, competing with the girls, and the disadvantages or the advantages of that.
Right.
It's been in the news a lot.
I'm happy to say that that my 9-year-old grandson is playing hockey with a lot of young women and men, both together.
Yeah.
Where when I was a child, I had 2 brothers, one 4 years older and one 4 years younger. So I was either too young, too old, or I was a girl and couldn't do that, the sports and stuff. But it's nice to see that the girls can get in there and do it right with the guys, so it really doesn't matter. And so this would play out normally without interference.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're going in a good direction.
I'm a teacher, and bathrooms come to mind. Our bathrooms are gendered in almost all public facilities. And not only are they labeled boy, girl, male, female, they're like, the facility is different in a boys' or men's restroom than in a girls' or women's restroom. And this creates a difficulty for somebody who is trans or non-binary in some way, who wants to not go into a gendered facility. They have to go to an alternate place that's pretty obvious. So it's the nurse's place or something like that. So it's not like you can blend in very well if you're in that, if you're struggling or if you're dealing with this identity aspect of gender in any public place.
Clothing is a common issue, I think. I have our 18-month-old grandson, and I chuckled because every time I've seen him dressed up for an occasion, they've had a little bow tie on his shirt.
Mm-hmm.
He has 3 sisters who have never worn a bow tie.
Yeah.
and my son and daughter-in-law are very open people to that, but I chuckle because he almost always has a bow tie on.
Yeah, I always wonder in families where you've got more boys than girls, you get that girl, you want her to get all the things that you didn't have for the sons, and so you tend to go a little extreme with the gender roles as a result.
Or even color choices. Where when I was growing up, you would not see a boy wearing something pink. That would be ridiculed. And then we've got a grandson whose favorite color was pink. His grandfather wasn't too keen on that. But then it went to orange and morphed a little bit. But it's nice to see that there's more color choices for little boys that are acceptable than there used to be.
Yeah.
And even hairstyles. Because he's got hair all over the place. And his mother puts it up in a samurai bun. Then he gets mistaken for a little girl. Then he has to say, I'm a boy. Well, then why do you have your hair like that? And it goes back and forth.
Absolutely, yeah. And you see girls that get like pixie cuts. I had a
That's me.
yeah. I knew a little girl who somebody misgendered her. She just got her hair cut really short. She's screaming, "I'm a girl!" They get very insistent.
We have a transgender grandchild who at a very young age really struggled with dressing in boy clothes. Parents and grandparents didn't know that. And until the child was given a chance to choose her own clothing, it was just a constant fight and struggle. Once, at 4 and 5 years old, the child knew who she was inside, even though the body didn't match. It made all the difference. It was just, clothing was a huge issue.
I have a friend who has twin boys. Now, everybody around them would say that one of them is gay. However, she would tell me that she would give them only boys' toys to play with because that would make the difference. So, they're like around 60 now, but it's just like, oh my gosh, if you ever discover and come to terms with who this man is, will you survive it? Because they are full of denial. But no, she gave them boys' toys to make sure they did not have any doubts or anything that would lead them astray.
I hear a lot of stories. I've got students that teach in preschools, and they'll say, "Why?" A parent will come in and just yell at them if their little boy goes into the dress-up clothes and is wearing like a princess costume when they pick him up. So there's some very clear expectations that once you have, if you're a boy, you do these things and you don't do the girl things. We give girls a little more leeway, I think, sometimes. Yeah.
Another thing, too, that people assign, which drives me crazy, is cooking. You go in there, and my son knows how to cook. I taught him how to cook. And his friends sit there online, and their parents will sit there and expect, it's like the girls to learn the role of cooking, the boys do not know. And then even nowadays, even the girls do not know. But unfortunately, it's very unfortunate. So my son makes sure that his friends, he's teaching them, he's like, cooking is for everyone. You all have to eat. You all have to survive. We're all college students or working, or some of them are starting to get married now and have families. It's like, you need to be able to provide for yourself. So it's not a gender role. It's everybody needs to be able to do it. Along with the clothing and makeup and hair. That's a lot of things that my son's friends, we do have transgender and our LGBTQ plus community friends, and they've struggled with the parents having specific boys and girls toys, boys and girls. My son had cooking equipment, dolls, and he had the trucks and electronics. If you wanted to play dress up with the cousins, you played dress up with the cousins. You wore makeup. He had long hair. It went from variations of long, and he had a mohawk, which he wore bright colors for me. Now he's long hair, bearded. So there's a lot of pressure for that for the young folk, for anybody in general actually, but for the young folk these days to be able to. Everybody sits there and says it's all the grandparents, aunts and uncles, older generation, and sit there and say you can't do that because it's boy or girl. And I'm listening to the nieces, nephews, siblings, my son fight back and say these are not gendered conditions. These are your perceived and generational gendered words you think you're using, but they belong to no gender. These are, everybody can do these things. Whether it's cultural, whether it's for the religious reasons or whatever, there are these different things that everybody can do.
And sometimes the parents' fear can feed into that. Fear that if their son is perceived as gay, they'll get the crap beat out of them. Fear that if their daughter is perceived as lesbian, they will be persecuted for that in whatever way that will be. So they're just not wanting to even think about their lovely child having to go those harder paths.
sometimes we impose these things because we care, and don't realize that we're creating harm either way, right? Yeah.
Or it could be the internalized homophobia of the parent is expressing itself in their child. Whoa, that would be a hard one too. If you hate that part of yourself that might be attracted to a man and you're a man. Then you have a gay son. That could be surprising too.
Absolutely.
Do you find that you get any pushback from some of the more conservative religions who think that this is science, not what the Bible teaches? Do you ever have anyone in class that thinks this is not right, even though it's biologically proven?
I have, maybe I've been lucky, that the students that have signed up when I teach gender and sexuality are usually the ones that want to know about, you know, a lot of things. So I think that the ones that don't want to be exposed to this information opt themselves out. So it's not a required class. You know, I've had some pushback here and there from students, but it's usually not too bad. So if we have these expectations as a society for people based on their gender, and everything seems to still be categorized as male and female, I think that like baby stuff has gotten worse recently. My son is almost 22, and I was looking for gender neutral stuff and found it really challenging back in 2001. And I think it's just become even more and more, it's either pink or blue, you can't find green or yellow or any of that sort of thing. So what happens when we do have young people who don't quite fit into this binary, that they may have had to be assigned one or the other at birth, but they don't, they want to play different sports. There are girls that want to play hockey, or they're boys that their favorite color is pink, or even just little things. What do we do as a society with these children? Are we still trying to force them into boxes, or are we starting to allow kids to be an array of different things?
It seems based on both theology and politics that we split into two groups. On the liberal side, there seems to be more willingness to live with the variety. You know, that on the conservative side, it seems a greater desire to stay with binary and boxes and more standard traditional expectations. It'd be nice to find some middle ground, but it seems that society is splitting that way. You're either becoming more open or more rigid, and kind of unsettling.
I have grandchildren that actually, when they thought their oldest daughter was questioning her sexuality, up and moved to Mississippi because that wasn't what was in the Bible, and that isn't what the father had learned through his religion. And I just pray for her because it's a political thing in a way. It's very political, and there's not too much you could do about it, but you just tell them you're there for them if they ever come to you for advice. But it's tough. It's really tough.
I saw a video on a man who was empathetic toward his little boy who wanted to choose to wear skirts. And the boy was 5 or 6, and so that the father started wearing skirts. He wore them everywhere, and he wore them proudly along with his little boy. And I thought, that's pretty cool.
And that's the best example right there. So what we do, we have a child, they're born. It's written in paper. Appears to be a son, it's my son. Gets a little older, wants to wear skirts. Why not? Be the example. That's all. We society what to do. But we can be the example. We can say, hey, my son wants to wear a skirt. A couple of years down the road, I have a daughter. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe I still have a son who wants to wear a skirt. This is fine. It's just written on paper. It's not carved in stone.
It's like a double standard, because women wear jeans, wear pants all the time.
Skirts are comfortable.
And women in Scottish, they wear skirts. They're not, they don't have that stigma.
My massage therapist, it wears a kilt. And I was kind of a little, oh, okay, at first. And then I got to know him, and he's awesome. It's just really awesome. He's awesome. His son's awesome. Then they had a problem with their roof, and I was saying to him, I'm going, "You're holding back something. What's going on? I need to know what's going on, because there's something that you're not quite right. I can feel it." And it was just that his house was flooding, and he was dealing with black mold. And I said, "Oh hell no! Oh, excuse me." But I said, "Oh no, you're coming to my house." And he stayed with me. They stayed with me for 2 months, and there was never any question or any problem. With my husband, he was very, they did their thing, we did ours, and and everything was fine. And I mean, I just saw him a few weeks ago. He's doing fine, and if he chooses to wear a kilt, great. That doesn't affect me in any way whatsoever.
Why is it that we do tend to be a little harder on?
Could you stand a little closer to the
Sorry, I don't talk loud enough. Why is it that we do tend to be a little bit harder on boys and force them into these masculine roles, but let girls have a little more freedom? They get to wear pants these days. Like my mom would say, she didn't get to wear pants, but you're lucky you can wear pants. But we've loosened it up where we're able to let girls try things that we would have traditionally labeled as masculine. But we're still struggling to let boys carry purses and wear pink and dresses if they want to.
It comes down to patriarchy. It's what we talked about last week. Anything that makes a man feminine lessens him, and that's wrong. But that's the prevailing attitude from patriarchy.
I don't think there's anything less feminine about a guy if he wears what they call a merce instead of a purse. I mean, we're in the technological age now where we need our tablet, we need our hairbrush. Guys got long hair too, so everything that we women need, the guys need their Kleenex and their nasal spray and whatever we've got in our purse. So if a guy has a merce, what they call it, a man's purse.
I don't know. I carry a purse sometimes. I just call it a purse. If I don't put all my stuff in my pockets, I have a purse. It's just a purse.
And I refuse to carry a purse. I've got no time for that. I don't take it. Not kidding.
I didn't hear what you said.
I refuse to carry a purse. If it doesn't fit in my pocket, I don't take it. Essentially.
Well, I'm a teacher also, and I see I see two sides of this, well, at least, but like there are a few cultures where the male macho thing is very, very, very deeply ingrained, and you see that in little 5-year-old boys and up. And yet we have a first grade boy whose favorite color is pink, and his parents are just supportive of whatever he does, and he's just the most delightful little child. And then I was walking through the lunchroom one day, and a 5th grade girl was talking to her friends about how she loved everybody. It didn't matter, male, female. So it sounded like she's, figuring out her place in the world in terms of gender. And so, you hear all sides of those. You see these boys who just they've got to be the macho guy and be in charge or whatever. And then you see those ones who are very accepting, and it's like, this is just who I am.
I think part of it's survival, because the traditionally the boy's been a breadwinner. The boy needs to be competitive to get the job. That means survival of him not making enough money to provide for the family. Now that's changed. People sit at their computers all day long at home and make a very good living. They don't have to be physically stronger than the next person when it was caveman days and the strongest one kills the mammoth, you know? So that to me is part of it. It's the competitive survival instinct of the male having to be the strongest in lots of different ways.
Yeah, some carryover from our evolutionary past.
Yeah.
So how would you, in a sentence or two, differentiate between sexual identity and gender identity? I mean, for helping conversations with folks, those two get mixed up or blended sometimes. Is there a way to kind of shorthand what's our sexual identity, what's our gender identity?
Are you thinking of sexual identity as like who we're attracted to?
Well, there's that too. There's biological identity. You talked about the variety that our bodies come in.
Yeah.
Yeah, sexual identity is, would you say then, who you're attracted to? Gender identity is who you perceive yourself to be. I mean, what's a clear way?
I would think of gender identity as your sense of your characteristics. So your sense of whether you tend to be more masculine or feminine or some strong blend in between. So it's a sense of who you are as a gendered being. Sexual identity is more who the person that we're physically attracted to, what their identity might be. So it could be that you identify as a male and your gender is masculine, but you're attracted to other men, so that your sexual identity would be more towards the homosexual end of that particular spectrum. I know it gets confusing when you start layering all of these things, but if you really think about it, I mean, we're all just people, and there's no way that we can all be the same because we've all had different experiences. So if you think about it as a way of putting yourself on a really wide spectrum of this is the anatomy I was born with and I'm comfortable with that, and my gender matches that or it doesn't, or it's somewhere else. They're just disconnected from each other. So it doesn't have to be that your male chromosomes and anatomy fit with your gender. Could be something else. They're either disconnected, I guess is the best way to think about it. You can't predict from one thing what something is on the other spectrums. Just because you know somebody is male doesn't mean you know who they're attracted to or what their gender might be. We can guess pretty well because still in society things line up more than they may in the future. But if you just figure that you just have to learn different pieces of information about people, just like you have to learn what they do, who their family is, where they live, what kind of car they drive, is just more pieces of information that makes a person a person.
It seems like a big topic these days is the role that schools are having in helping to persuade children to make decisions about who they are, who they identify with, and controversy about that. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
So you may be getting at the idea that schools are encouraging kids to not identify with their assigned.
Or to make choices that that adults who have a hard time understanding gender and sexuality can approve of, and that somehow schools are influencing kids to make all these decisions at early ages, and people object to that. Two of my granddaughters go to a school where they are required to know the pronouns that all their teachers use, and on all the kids in their classroom. They're like third and fifth graders, so everybody knows each other's pronouns that they identify with, and so someone might really say, okay, the school is pushing that subject and trying to force children into making identifications that they surely are not ready to make, and it seems like it causes a lot of distress with people who don't agree with that philosophy.
Sure. I think anytime we start doing things differently than we did them when we were kids, it's difficult. I learned math this way, so I don't understand why you want to learn math differently. And so I think part of that is just the fear of difference, which is somewhat of a natural human tendency to be a little shy of change, because there's safety in what we know and what's familiar to us.
But isn't that awfully early to get the children where they're making those decisions? I mean, I remember having my son, my youngest son, my little Marine, call him. He was my youngest son. He was like, I don't know, 5 or 6. They were calling for vocations at church, and the pastor was calling. And he said, oh, I could do that. And he's slamming my, I could do that. And then he's going, and you have to be able to, not be interested in girls. And he's slamming my, I don't like girls. Well, of course, he's only 5 or 6. Of course, he hasn't grown into that yet, so he doesn't really know. So why are you bombarding these kids with, hey, you need to pick one? No. Just let time work it. So, and that's just my opinion. I just, maybe you'll figure out, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I guess my question would be, why do we think that having a child decide what their pronouns are now in 3rd grade is worse than asking them what they want to be when they grow up? So we pin kids down to, I'm going to be a firefighter, and then we don't force them to do that when they actually graduate high school. We let them choose. And so why do we think that with a pronoun choice at the same age, that is set in stone? It's not. They might change, and they may not.
But doesn't that make it confusing? I mean, we've got instructors here. For the instructors to go, okay, well, this week you identify with this pronoun, but next week, and the teachers are just trying to pass out the assignments and communicate with kids, and all of a sudden they're tethered to this, calling someone the appropriate pronoun. To me, I mean, I've had people bite at me. I mean, just viciously attack me. I'm this or I'm that, and I'm not. And it's like, sorry, I just walked in the room and met you. I'm
hard.
Trying to buy a vowel.
When you don't want to make a mistake because you don't want to hurt people and you don't want to offend them.
But then
you're
you
just
don't want to
doing
be
the best you
attacked
can.
if you're, if you accidentally, don't use the right pronoun. It's hard.
There needs to be some grace from everyone, right? That if you misgendered somebody and you use the wrong pronouns, it's embarrassing for you, and it can be hurtful and embarrassing for them. And then I think often we dig in and make it worse by not just saying, I'm sorry, and using the right ones and moving on with life, instead of having to explain why you misgendered them.
So if you don't know, do you call the person they? Is that what the thing is?
I think that's an option. I think there's some people that might be offended by being termed they when they feel very strongly that they're a she. There are ways to talk without having to use pronouns, and just use their name. I understand your frustration. I really do. I experience it myself too with students, and I'm like, it's really hard because I grew up with this it's either he or she, and there was no, when you wrote, you used the generic masculine, right? And so it's challenging. I think it'll get easier as we get more used to it.
Well, the other thing is the congregation of verbs. I mean, I speak a little Spanish, not a lot, but I mean, it's like my brain is just like overloaded, too much input. I mean, it used to be he, she, the standard congregations, and now that's all to the wind. It just confuses me to no end. And I think, well, gee, I'd like to go to Italy, I'd like to go here and there, and basically, everything's, if that ever happens in my lifetime, then that's different all over the world now. I mean, it's just, I don't know how to process that.
Just use hey you.
One thought or question with regard to the children in school and pronouns and gender identity is don't, for example, what come to be called trans folks have a pretty good sense of their not being cisgendered by age 3 or 4 or 5.
They do really early. If you think of we are really confident developmentally about gender. By the time we're about 3, we can pick out boys and girls and things that belong to girls and things that are supposed to be for boys. We hammer it in so hard in society that the kids, by the time they're in their preschool age, they understand what gender is pretty well, and they understand it for themselves.
So asking folks to use the pronouns for the children, that the children say, "This is me, not that." It may be hard for us to make that adjustment, but it might be one of the most respectful things we could do for somebody trying to find their way.
And I think it creates a culture of respect, hopefully, within the community who speaks that way around one another. And it creates an opportunity for grace. Because the more that you are exposed and you get to know people who are different from yourself, the more accepting you are in general. And so whether a child holds to that identity the entire rest of their life or not, I think is less important than making them feel seen and heard for who they are by more than just 1 or 2 individuals in the community. And that would be my goal in any effort to understand pronouns.
I think part of why it's so hard for us is that we do think about sex as being, it's biological and it's fixed. And so if it's biological and it's fixed, then if a child decides that their sex is not what we think it is, then we think that it can't. We really struggle with it if we just kind of loosen up on this idea that everything is set in stone and that things change throughout our lives, then maybe we can get a little more comfortable. But I think allowing people to make mistakes is something that's missing from our society in general. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to make a mistake.
One of the things my daughter taught us was, when it comes to matters of sexuality in particular, and identity, to ask someone the question who's having trouble with it just simply being their choice and why did they choose it, is to ask, so at what age did you choose to like boys or like girls? And most people respond, I didn't choose, I just do. I mean, that we know that fairly early. And so there must be kids within our society who aren't sure who they like. I mean, and that's a developmental sort of thing. Yeah.
Or identify asexual.
Yeah.
Where they have no sexual feelings that they are aware of for anybody.
We need to honor your time as well. Any last questions for the professor?
Thank you for the conversation and not making me talk for now. Thank you.
So next week, we get this
Everybody.
over